Green Bay Packers quarterback Aaron Rodgers to say he saw a UFO on a podcast. Listen to this.
It was definitively large in the night sky, moving from left to right. Again, we're at like 12:30 at night here.
Yeah.
It was me and Steve and his brother that saw it. And it goes out of sight, and we look at each other and go, what in the was that?
That would probably be a pretty good reaction.
Make you do that? That's a natural reaction.
Wisconsin. NFL star Aaron Rodgers' estranged family is not impressed with the recent comments he made about religion. An insider tells us Aaron's family was dismayed and added that comments he made on his girlfriend Danica Patrick's Pretty Intense podcast were a slap in the face, as they put it. Aaron revealed that he had trouble connecting with his religious community as a child and said, quote, "Most people that I knew, church was just, you just had to go." That was his quote. Aaron also shared that he has gone down a path to a different type of spirituality that is more meaningful to him.
I just didn't find any connection points with those things, and started questioning things, and had friends who had other beliefs, and enjoyed learning. That's kind of a part of my life. Had some good friendships along the way that helped me, to figure out what exactly I wanted to believe in. And ultimately, it was that the rules and regulations and binary systems don't really resonate with me. Enjoyed learning about other religions and meeting the Dalai Lama. And, it's been a fun path to a different type of spirituality, which to me is it's been more meaningful.
Aaron did not specifically refer to himself as an atheist, but said that religion can divide people. He said, quote, "Religion can be a crutch."
Religion can be a crutch, can be something that people have to make themselves feel better. And because it's set up binary, it's us and them. It's saved and unsaved. It's heaven and hell. It's enlightened and heathen. It's holy and righteous and sinner and filthy. And I think that makes a lot of people feel better about themselves. Is that, I got Jesus, and I'm saved, and I'm going to heaven, and there's only 144,000 of us going, even though there's 7 billion people on the planet.
Aaron has been estranged from his family for several years, including Bachelorette alum Jordan Rodgers. He's not spoken publicly about the reasons behind that estrangement, but an insider tells People that religion is actually part of it. The insider adds that Aaron's family still loves him very much, but disagree with him about fundamental things. In a 2017 interview with the New York Times, Aaron's father, Ed Rodgers, said that fame can change things, and that Aaron allegedly stopped talking to his family members at the end of 2014, shortly after he began dating actress Olivia Munn.
Church was you just had to go. Your parents made you go, you wake up, you put some clothes on, you go, and you can't wait to get back and watch the second game of the day in the NFL on TV. But I started going to Young Life, and that's where I met Matt Hawk, who Matt was leading our Young Life group there for a while, and he was the first Christian that I met where I was like, man, this dude swears every now and then. He loves sports. He coaches sports. He's he's an awesome dude. He's just a really rad guy to be around. I kind of like the way that he talks about Jesus, and the way that he talks about what it means to have a relationship with Christ. That's pretty cool. So I enjoyed my time with Young Life. We did some amazing outreach stuff. We went to Mexico during 2 spring breaks and built houses in Florido, outside Tijuana, rough areas. That was meaningful. That was really meaningful work. And there's not really a Young Life for college. It gets into more organized, athletes in action or whatever it might be, campus organizations. And I just didn't find any connection points with those things, and started questioning things. And
would you separate the two, being spirituality and religion? You were religious and now you're spiritual?
I think both can work for people. I do. I think, again, it's very black and white, binary in binary sense, but I don't think it's very welcoming. And, I don't know how you can believe in a God who wants to condemn most of the planet, to a fiery hell. What type of loving, sensitive, omnipresent, omnipotent being wants to condemn most of his beautiful creation to a fiery hell at the end of all this.
But long before the issue of climate change and globalism was on the scene, there was another lie that is really a byproduct of what we call modernism. And if you put it into a philosophical context, you have the Enlightenment created modernism, and modernism led to postmodernism, and then postmodernism now is moving into what we call hypermodernism, and I don't have time to break those down for you, but probably will in future opportunities. But modernism represented a departure from the biblical worldview that had been pretty much embraced, especially in the Western world, for a couple of millennia, and were replaced with what we call the scientific worldview. And I use that word scientific advisedly because it's not particularly scientific. It claims to be based upon an empirical approach to life. In other words, we just the facts, ma'am, nothing but the facts. But in fact, there's no such thing as just the facts. It's often influenced by our feelings and our opinions. And particularly, we found it began to really get rooted into a culture with a Darwinian theory of evolution. You see, I call it the evolutionary theory of nihilism, because nihilism is simply a philosophy that says, but the unforeseen effect of that was it created generations who said life essentially has no meaning, no purpose, outside of whatever pleasure and advantage I can personally experience. And it began to reduce men from being man the thinker, which is what Homo sapien means, into man the feeler. And suddenly, my sensory perceptions became key to everything in life. As we find today, people are saying, how are you feeling? Tell me what you really think, or what you really feel. Really? Seriously? My feelings are about as dependable as the weather in Spokane. But this began to breed a theological liberalism, because if God didn't create everything, what is the Bible all about? What is religion all about? Well, suddenly religion becomes nothing more than a coping mechanism composed of a lot of mythological ideas to comfort the hearts of those who aren't as intellectually superior as the people in the white ivory towers are. That gave place to an atheistic humanism that basically said man is the ultimate reality. He's the center of the universe, and everything should revolve around man instead of revolving around God. We became essentially our own deity. And you see, as we began to make ourselves the defining characteristic, one of the things we find is that we have so many divergencies amongst us. We even talk about as one of our social goals to strive for diversity. You know, diversity never led to anything really except confusion and chaos and anarchy. Most of us get conflicted because we're trying to create a unified perspective of our life in this world. What does it mean, and what should I be focusing my energies upon? But if everything is just scattered data with no interpretive grid, then I'm suddenly left with a confused life. So someone came up with, well, it's all about existentialism, not the philosophical existentialism. It said, reality is whatever you personally feel it is, because it's all relative. Your truth is relative to my truth, so that you can have your truth and I'm going to have my truth. I love what Rabbi Zacharias said when he was debating a professor who had this point of view, that he says it's not an and either or, it's a and then reality. And he said, well, let me tell you the reality. In India, when you step off the curb, it's not either or, it's both and. Either the bus wins or you lose, you win. But you can't survive both. The bus is a reality that crashes into your life. And the simple fact is that every one of us live in a world where reality always seems to crash into our existential fantasies. But that brings us to where we are today, and that's libertinism. which is basically a disregard of morality, especially a disregard of sexual morality. The lie of libertinism began to become mainstream in the 1960s. George Gilder, who is the founder of the Discovery Institute and is one of the real Renaissance men of our age, put it very simply. He said the ultimate vision of the sexual liberationists is that the two sexes are essentially identical and inessentially and arbitrarily divided. In other words, men and women are essentially the same thing. Yet, the problem, he goes on to point out, is that reality tells us something quite different. He adds, he says, to most people over the centuries, this view would have seemed preposterous. And so it is. For after all these years, scientists have finally affirmed what non-experts like you and me have always known, quote, that there are profound and persistent biological differences between the sexes, which every man and woman are subjected to different hormonal influences that shape their bodies, their brains, their temperaments in different ways. The sexes become significantly different even in the very organization of their brains during the time in the womb. Even the way our brains are formed, that men tend to process data mentally differently than the way that women process data. Is there a woman in this room who hasn't discovered this already? Some of you are saying, oh, whatever, why does it matter? Live and let live. Let me begin with something that G.K. Chesterton noted many years ago. He said, when the unthinkable becomes debatable, it will eventually become acceptable. You see, we cross the Rubicon here. We cross this point where suddenly intellectually we have really given up our critical thought. Yet we're asked to suspend reality so as not to offend somebody's dysmorphic fantasy. But again, why is this happening? Again, Chesterton, one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, once wrote, he says, when a man stops believing in God, he doesn't believe in nothing. He believes in anything. He believes in anything. On New Year's Eve, the NBC broadcast from Times Square in New York City was not very good, actually. But behind the host, there was a banner at one point declaring the theme for their 2020. They said, no judgment. No judgment. In Acts 17:31, the apostle declared, he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice. The loss of that perspective in regards to what we see happening in our culture is, I think, the thing that's most troubling to me. The loss of a sense of mission and greater purpose than my best life now is deeply troubling to me. Because I think what's going to ultimately lead to the great apostasy that Paul foretold is that we just entertain ourselves to death. We can't be quarrelsome about these things. We have to be kind. We have to have the ability to instruct people correctly. We have to be patient when they wrong us for those corrections. And we need to correct them with gentleness, no matter how stiff the opposition.
If God is just, then why give the eternal punishment of hell for temporal sin?
Thank you.
Glad we could do your question.
Thank you for that question. It's a really, really good one, and not just the question about hell, but that idea of eternal punishment for temporal sin. I see that distinction in your question, and it makes it a harder question, and I appreciate that. Let me start off, if it's all right, because I can continue on from what I was saying. I think sometimes we vastly underestimate our sin and its consequences in this life. You know, sometimes when I try to explain the idea of sin to people, they want to say to me, well, really, you're exaggerating. You're not too bad. It's not like you've killed anyone. Well, I just told you that story of the guy from my childhood who went on to commit. So if you ask me that question, have I killed anyone? That's actually a much more difficult question for me to answer than you might think it is. And then what are the consequences of the way I use my free will in his life, him taking his life? What did that do in the context of his family? What will that do in the context of the future generations to come? It's sobering to think about that. You know, sometimes I can look back on my life as a teenager right now and say, man, I thought at the time that was no big deal, but the reality was that was truly terrible. Well, any progress I have made in life, it's about that much. Imagine how far along this path God would be. Imagine if the standard is not someone you see on the 6 o'clock news who has done something worse than you so you can feel better about yourself. What if the standard is a perfectly holy God? A perfectly holy God who loves each one of us. What would our sin look like from his perspective? And the multiplying and the exponential effects of that sin. Maybe Jesus gives us an idea in some of his statements that lust would look like adultery, that unjust anger would look like murder. So temporal sin, eternal punishment, when I think about the reality of my sin, I don't see the gap the way you might initially presume that it is there. But now let's talk just briefly about this idea of hell itself. How are we to understand this idea? I think one of the best ways to understand it is in a relational framework. Jesus invites us into relationship with himself. A relationship can only be entered into if both people say yes to that relationship. If we are not willing to say yes to that relationship, then there's nothing that Jesus can do on his side. Sometimes people say, why is Jesus the only way to heaven? And I answer, well, because Jesus is heaven. That's what heaven is. Why is Jesus the only way to eternal life? Well, because Jesus is eternal life. Flourishing relationship with the God who created you and desires to be in friendship and relationship with you more than anything. That's what eternal life is. It's not just some theme park that we get a ticket to and then we can go or decide not to go. It is the relationship itself. And that's why someone like Christopher Hitchens said, heaven would be hell for me. Why? Because he doesn't want to be with God. Because he said that explicitly at one point in his life. People like Friedrich Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre, Thomas Nagel, the philosopher, they say, I don't want to be with God. It would be an invasion of my privacy. It would take away my autonomy. That's not attractive to me. Well, if that's not attractive to you, then God is not going to force you to be with him. And being apart from him in the context of eternity, that's what we call hell. It's interesting that the Bible uses a phrase when it refers to hell at times. It talks about weeping and gnashing of teeth. That may seem like a very harsh phrase to you, and it always did to me as well. But in my family, we've dealt with a lot of estrangement. At one time, 2 uncles of mine, they didn't speak for about 7 years. But I have a vivid memory of the 2 of them being at a wedding together. They both had to be at this wedding. They had to be in each other's physical presence and yet relationally estranged. And you know what I saw on their faces? Literally weeping and gnashing of teeth. That is the natural reaction to being in the presence of someone who you know full well you're supposed to be family with, the person who is supposed to love you most, the person you were intended to be in the deepest friendship with, and knowing that there's nothing other than your own stubbornness that keeps you from being together with them. That all it would have taken on either side, just one of my uncles, to say, I'm sorry, will you forgive me? And that relationship would have been restored. And it is the same with God. He will not force that upon us, but if we will just say, I'm sorry, there is nothing he desires more deeply than relationship with each one of us.
That implant those kind of ideas in our mind through all sorts of vehicles, and especially in this quote-unquote information age, his ability to send disinformation, talking about fake news, he puts all sorts of ideas into our heads that distort and twist and lead astray. It's interesting that when Adolf Eichmann was condemned for his part in masterminding the Holocaust, he said, one of his last words is, "One day you will thank us for what we did." And you sit there and going, what kind of twisted mind believes that? And a twisted mind that has been deceived to believing that evil is good. It's important but overlooked oftentimes that the Bible never suggests that Satan's attacks will come with some kind of overwhelming onslaught of demons, but that forces men to both believe and follow after his lies. Rather, what Paul points out to the Corinthians is this: just as Eve was deceived by the serpent's cunning, your minds may somehow be led astray.